I'm Jeff Zarnett, and this is Software Career Growth. Today, I'm going to talk about what I'm looking for when I'm reviewing a coding challenge. So in a recent video, I talked about what we're looking for in a design interview, and I was fortunate enough to have a guest, Mia, join me for that. But today I want to talk about a take-home coding challenge kind of interview, because the place where Mia and I previously worked had that kind of challenge. Let's get this out of the way. So it is possible that you could ask some AI to help or write your code challenge for you. Not ideal, but you could do it, right? And the distinct possibility is that it generates something good, and when I review it, I will be happy with it, but then when I talk to you in an interview, I'm going to have questions about it, and if you don't know why something is the way it is, you don't understand it really, that's going to come up, and that will be concerning, right? But take-home tests always had this problem. Even before AI, there was always the possibility that a candidate could get their friend, their cousin, their neighbor to do it for them, and that would look good, that would be good work, but they would be unable to explain it. So the AI aspect of it hasn't really changed things in this regard too much, even though, yeah, it is worth talking about. As to whether coding challenges are dead and should not exist in the future, that's a discussion I think for another video. The answer is maybe. But enough of that. So let's imagine that you have a take-home challenge, and the take-home challenge is something that you will spend some time on and sort of work on at your own pace and will hopefully at least a little bit enjoy doing. Right. It's important, I think, to note that as a take-home challenge is unpaid work, you should be careful about how much time you're going to put into it, because it is very frustrating if you put in 20, 30 hours only to get a rejection at a later stage in the process. But let's imagine that we're not doing that. So what am I looking for in the coding challenge? So the coding challenge asks you to solve a particular problem, and I want to see that that problem is in fact solved, right? If it's asking you to, assign passengers to planes and try to do that in an optimal way so that everybody arrives on time and maximizes time for connections but minimizes time spent at the airport, something like that, right? If that's the nature of the challenge, and I've just made this one up, so I don't have specific suggestions about it, then did you solve the problem? If the answer is no, that's a bad sign, right? Something that's half finished or doesn't work or does not work as expected is probably not going to pass, right? If you didn't solve the problem, why are we here? Okay, but it's not enough to solve the problem, it's also about how you solve the problem. And that's a big part of what's being evaluated in this regard. So here's a number of things in no particular order that I would look for when reviewing a code challenge. So number one is obviously correct functionality. Does it do what it's supposed to do, which we talked about. But the next thing that I want to look at is tests. Are there tests for this, and are they good tests? Right? I interviewed a candidate one time and they wrote one unit test just to prove that they could. And you know what? I didn't really see that as enough. Right? So do your unit tests work? Right? Do they actually test the code that they are supposed to be testing? And how thorough are they? There is such a thing as too thorough, but are you testing common edge cases? Are you testing known corner cases, things like that? Do you test both yes and no answers, right? If you're being asked to assign people to planes and there's a possibility that there's not enough seats, do you have a test scenario that covers that, where you have to tell somebody, sorry, this flight is sold out, you're not going to be able to take the trip according to the schedule that you planned? That's a no as a valid answer kind of thing. And do you cover that in your tests? Did you think about it? Another thing that I want to look at is good structure in your code. An application typically has different layers in it. If it's a web application, there's an API layer, and there's a services layer, and there's a database layer, and the things that you do should be located in their respective layers, and you shouldn't have, when an API call comes in, it directly accesses some database something, because this isn't putting good structure to your program, and not having good structure is not a good indication for the future, because hey, if you're going to work on something, I mean, yeah, it might be sort of quicker and easier to just throw some code anywhere, but it's a maintainability nightmare, and you won't observe that when you're working on a take-home challenge. It's only going to take a couple hours of work, but it will be a problem when this is what we're doing full-time, day after day. So making sure that you follow good structure and that you follow a reasonable system for how the code is going to be organized, that's good. Even better if this test application that you have comes with one. If you follow the existing structure, that's okay. But if you completely changed it, but it was still a perfectly good structure, I wouldn't see that as negative, as long as there is a structure, right? The next thing that I would typically be looking for in this situation is, are there reasonable comments around anything that is not immediately obvious, right? Not immediately obvious is highly variable, and if you're new or you're junior, things are very not obvious to you that are well understood by someone who has many years of experience, and that's perfectly fine. You don't have to get everything right, but if you call into some library and this thing takes 10 parameters, maybe a comment around it would be interesting, or maybe a comment that states certain assumptions that you are expecting about your data would also be good. Another thing that is not strictly necessary, but something that I would look at, is the commit messages. Doing everything in one giant commit message isn't necessarily wrong, right? I worked at a place where the expectation was you worked in a feature branch, and at the end of the feature branch you would squash all the commits into one, and then you would merge it, and that way the main branch would have one commit for that, even if it had 50 file changes in it. So I'm not meaning it just like that, but I would like to see, did you use a pull request kind of workflow? Were there commits along the way? Do your commits explain what they're doing? Right? It's easy to write commits that just say blah or fix bug or something like that, but do they explain what they're doing? Do you have to do this in every real situation? I'm going to say no. And lots of times in practice, you will have like a ticket system. So you will have a commit that says fix bug 1, 2, 3, 4, and a link to the ticket. And you don't really need to do a lot of explaining, right? This sort of thing is normal, but when you are doing a coding challenge, this is an audition, put on your best show. So make sure that you are, in fact, putting a meaningful commit message. It does not have to be 3 paragraphs long. You don't need a long, lengthy explanation about why you chose this versus that, this, that, the other. But as long as you're saying, okay, I am introducing functionality that redirects people from this location to that location if their plane is full, that's good enough for a reviewer to understand. All right. Optional, but nice if you have some sort of change log where you keep track of, okay, here are the changes that I've made, and update versioning. It's not make or break, but I think it would be kind of interesting if you did have something to that effect. In general, things that I don't want to see, I don't want to see too many things that are left as like to do, or I'll come back to this, even though sort of you're not going to. If it would be small and easy to do, but you didn't do it, why did you leave it in there? It's one thing if it's going to be a big task, like to do in the future, this should migrate from being a standalone application to running in a Docker container. That makes sense. But if it's to do clean up this API, it wouldn't take very long if you used some tools. A good IDE would make that happen. So show me that you pay attention to detail in this sort of thing, and that would be better than just sort of leaving a bunch of things as to do. Other things I don't like to see, again, not a deal breaker, but poorly formatted code. Yes, chances are some segments of code will be copy pasted from Stack Overflow or from elsewhere on the internet. That's just how the profession works, and there's nothing wrong with that. But use a formatter. Again, an IDE can make it very easy. You can just use the built-in tool to reformat the file, makes your code look consistent, and shows me again that you pay attention to these kinds of things. and that you understand what it's like to work in a company where it's not just you looking at the code, and where you need to maintain this for the foreseeable future. In general, though, so other things that are not ideal to see, anything that's really redundant, a big waste of time. If you fetch something from the database and then throw it away and then fetch it again immediately, that's not great. It's a little bit wasteful. Again, that wouldn't be an automatic no for a candidate, but it's still these are inefficiencies that I would like to see stamped out. As if somebody had, as a code reviewer, said to you, hey, here's what you should change about this, right? This is redundant, or this is not okay, right? And so that sort of leads me to the final two things that I would give as advice about this, right? The first one is that very few of the things that I talked about in this are necessarily deal breakers. The lack of the application compiling or running or accomplishing the goal would obviously be a deal breaker. But for most of the things that we talked about, anything that you do in the positives, increases the score. Anything you do in the negative decreases the score. And if your score is above a certain threshold, then I will say yes. I want to go to the next step where I'm going to talk to you about the code and ask you about your design decisions and things like that. If your score is below the threshold, then I'm going to say no. I don't think this is up to our standard, and that's not going to work. So very few things are make or break, but every little thing that you do that increases your score is worth doing, and every little thing you do that would decrease your score is worth removing or fixing, or at the very least putting in a comment addressing, saying, yeah, it would be better to switch this to a different library, but no time for that. The other thing is, because you have time, don't feel that you have to rush through this, right? Write the code, sleep on it, revisit it in the morning as if you are a code reviewer, and try to come up with some good suggestions. Anything you can do that improves the code quality is going to look good as far as the reviewer is concerned. And at the end of the day, the important thing is that everybody involved understands that a take-home test is not necessarily strictly representative of the kind of work that you're going to be doing. It's just a way of validating that you do indeed have the programming skills that you say that you do, without it being a high-stress, synchronous kind of test, right? And I've also had some interviews in the past where somebody sits with me in a video call, and they're watching as I screen share, and I'm typing in the box how to implement a linked list in C++ or something. Those sorts of high-pressure situations are also not very representative of what life is really like when you're working in software development. You will not be having somebody looking over your shoulder at all times. You don't have a strict time limit in which you must complete this exercise before the interview ends. It's easier to look things up or to consult with a colleague. So take-home test is meant to be more like that, but it's not going to be exactly like that. And everybody understands, I think, or at least everybody should understand, that it's not 100% real life, and that's okay, right? It's just meant to be a little bit more fair than the high pressure. While we're in the room, can you solve this problem while I stand over your shoulder and look at you judgmentally? They say in school, we don't reward necessarily learning as much as we do reward people who are good at taking tests, and the take-home test is meant to address that at least a little bit. So I hope this gave you some insight into what I'm thinking about when I look at a take-home test and why they are the way they are, and I hope this will help you in landing your next role.